Welcome to the Hudson County Bar Association Oral History. Today we have as our guest a former Hudson County Bar President, Greg Farmer, someone I've known for well more than a quarter of a century, and we'll stop at that. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Lennon. Nice to be here.
It's great because I'm so happy that the Bar Association continues its effort to talk about what the history of the Hudson County Bar is like, because not that many people always get to see lawyers, not always, and then when they do need a lawyer, they want to know who they're going to and get comfortable with the kind of people that they're going to meet. And so the oral history can at least tell people, our viewers, something about what we're all about and how we're here to help people. So welcome, Greg.
Thank you.
So, Greg, why don't you tell our viewing public a bit about your background, how you decided to, your education background, how you decided to become a lawyer?
Well, I graduated from St. Peter's College here in Jersey City. I grew up in Jersey City. I then went to Seton Hall Law School. And the reason I wound up going to law school was, at that time, the Hudson County Bar Association started a law school scholarship.
Now, I'm not going to ask what year that is, but it was in the 60s, I imagine.
Yes, it was in the late 60s. And the situation with that was members of the bar decided that they wanted to do something to help the legal community. They created a scholarship. And at the time, there were only about 3 or 4 of us who were receiving scholarships. And that, as a result of that, that kind of moved me into going to law school, gave me the opportunity to go to law school, helped financially to go to law school, because back then that scholarship paid a lot of the law school.
Back then, law school tuition was a lot cheaper.
Absolutely.
Probably a fraction of what it is today.
But just as a point of interest, that scholarship program probably, when it was first created, was created maybe with a fund of $15,000 or $20,000. That fund now is $650,000.
Lieberman was part of that? Who?
Yes,
Part of the original people?
There's a legendary number of lawyers who were prominent in Hudson County who founded it, contributed to it, and got it moving.
Harold Roosevelt Sr. too?
Yes. Both Harold Roosevelt Sr. and Harold Roosevelt Jr. were instrumental. The scholarships were given out like to 3 people, has now ballooned to where we give out close to 45.
Well, the dinners where we honor and present them are just absolutely drop-dead phenomenal. They're just great.
Absolutely. And those dinners really highlight the kind of personality of the county, because many, many times the people who are receiving the scholarship are firstborn in the United States. Their parents, many times, because of the demographics of the county, are from minority community, immigrant communities, and it's really an interesting thing to see them come and be so proud of their son or daughter who's receiving a scholarship. And also the Bar Association is greatly honored for what they have done with respect to making it possible to help people become lawyers.
Now, you've seen a lot of changes since you started out. I know you're very active with the Hudson County Bar Foundation, but if you could think back to when you first started, and even thinking about the complexion of the judiciary, our bench in Hudson County, how it's changed over the years. You mentioned the minorities. I mean, today is very different than back in the 60s.
Oh, no question about it. And as a matter of fact,
you didn't have women. I'm trying to remember who the first woman was.
Well,
Was it Tolentino or
it may have been Tolentino.
Davis? Davis was, I know, that was
Judge
came out of
Davis
municipal.
probably might
Yeah.
have been the first woman, or Tolentino. There's an interesting photograph, and it was taken from the newspaper, presumably the Jersey Journal, and it's posted in the chambers of, now Judge Mantaneo, Judge Saluzzo, which is the assignment office, so to speak, for matrimonial. And it is a photograph of all of the judges in Hudson County at the time, and it was taken in the 70s.
I can recall a time, and correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't even have a family part. I remember, I think Judge Schaefer was like the first presiding. It was like kind of scattered. It was everybody. I mean, we had Hudson for a period of time, Harrington, we had Connors for a brief. They were all going through the ropes, but then we had also the juvenile. I mean, that's all under one umbrella. But I don't think we had a family part at one point.
Well, you didn't have a family part. You had that juvenile part.
But your Chancery Division,
yes,
it's like.
But it was really a stepchild of the whole thing. Quite frankly, before the people you mentioned, Schaefer and the others, there was Judge McAlevey, the father of Dennis, who was a very accomplished lawyer here in New Jersey.
I never had an opportunity to know.
And I'll tell you something about Judge McAlevey. And yes, Judge Hudson, Judge Connors, Judge Harrington, and also Judge Heckman was there. And Judge McAlevey, and this is how things have changed, and when that era, you really had very strict divorce laws. And so it was a whole different culture. But Judge McAlevey would not let somebody get divorced unless they came into court with a suit jacket and a tie. And
well, most of your practice is family law, matrimonial, that kind of thing.
Yes.
I mean, for the most part.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's a reflection of the development of the bar and the law. Law is far more complicated than when I started. Years ago when I started, a lawyer did everything. He did the closings, he did everything from adoption to zoning. Don't do that anymore. Everybody is a specialist. The court system has kind of designated people or kind of moved them into certain areas. And like for myself, not that I sought it out, but my experience in family law just came as the kind of practice developed. And you get certifications. I'm a certified matrimonial lawyer, just like there are certified trial lawyers,
criminal lawyers.
So you can see that the practice has moved from a general practice to specializations, and they're always creating new specializations.
I could safely say I haven't done a divorce since the mid-'90s, but whenever I had one with Greg, you were a worthy adversary. Yeah. So I have to say that.
But even in that, if you want to bring that up, even in that, things have gotten so complicated. You back in the 60s or before the liberation by legislature of the divorces.
74, I think it was.
Yeah, but it became, you never knew, or you never even considered, or it was never even talked about the sophistication of the issues you get now. For example, quadrille, which is a qualified domestic relations order, wherein a spouse will get the other part of the other spouse's pension, 401ks, college tuition, relocation, which is a big issue now because of the fact of people easily being able to travel.
Split custody, dual custody, joint custody.
And, switching the traditional roles. Many times you'll have a father staying home and a mother could be a high earner and she's working. But it's become far more complicated. Back in the 60s, it was just a stepchild. People went there and argued about why I should get a divorce. He did or she did this. And the financial part of it, nobody even spoke about pensions, let alone creating an interest in a pension.
It was basically a house and cash in a bank.
That was it. Absolutely.
And then how much you're going to pay. And I remember doing a divorce where the parties argued over a dog, and I said, I'm not going to Judge Schaefer to tell him that you can't settle this because you can't decide who is going to take the dog.
Well, you'll be surprised at how now, with people getting so attached to dogs or animals, how that is an issue when it comes up, because they can't, they both love the dog and they can't separate from the dog.
And part of it's, I want the dog because you're not going to get the dog. You know,
There's no question about it. That emotion confuses people's brains, and there's a lot of emotion in matrimonial, and there's a lot of lingering emotion because, unlike in other disciplines of the law, the case is never over. I mean, in a civil case, jury says you're got to pay or you don't pay. Criminal case, you're guilty or not guilty. Matrimony, you start out when they're 3 and you take them through college.
I do a lot of estate contests. Families arguing over money. But eventually it's over, and it's money. It's not kids. It's not who's going to take the kid for Christmas versus the birthday versus New Year's and all that. And I got tired of one side or the other calling me up and saying they're late by 5 minutes. What can I do? And or they're not getting. And it was just such a frustration. And I said to a lot of clients, I don't do it because I don't want to tear families apart because of the kids. Money's one thing. Brothers and sisters want to argue, spouses, siblings want to argue over money. That's easy to handle. But kids, I mean, that's tough.
There's
Greg.
no question about it. As a matter of fact, I'm involved in a custody case right now where we just finished a testimony yesterday. There's no question about kids in the middle, and they suffer a great deal. And tell you the truth,
Psychologically, they must have some tough stuff.
Look, let me tell you this. Take it from me. Parents who fight about kids grow up screwed up. That's what happens. So until you can get the emotion out of the equation, you're always going to have that. But I also have to say, disputes between parents over kids have always been long-standing. But now there are some alternatives. Aside from the fact that the lawyers and the judges have a higher degree of sensitivity in these issues, nevertheless, it's become very popular to have counseling involved, have intervention involved, so you don't just have 2 adults screaming their heads off. There's no question about it. It's a slow, frustrating, expensive proposition. Very true.
Let me ask you this, because, again, I've been out of the loop in terms of that calendar and process, but I mean, the calendars used to be pretty heavy, and the judges used to spend a lot of time trying to settle cases, sometimes 5 at a time, lawyers going back and forth, reporting back and forth. But now you have a mediation process which didn't exist historically. How long has mediation been around? As now it's a mandatory thing, right, Greg?
Yes. What happens is this, that a few years ago there was a study, and they came up with the conclusion that divorce cases take too long and cost too much. So once they were armed with that, they put in some deadlines, which sometimes have proved to be problematic, dealing with a case that's got to be over within a certain period of time.
And that's pretty true of all the calendars, whether it's criminal or civil or matrimonial.
But again, especially in matrimonial, there is intervention for alternative ways of trying to resolve the case, because you got to start with something. You can talk about the bad side, about arguing, all fighting, all this kind of stuff. The reality is that 98% of all cases settle. That's not because I say it. Statistics tell you that. Statistics tell you that 98% of all divorce cases settle. Well, once you get to that conclusion, the only question is when. So they have a whole bunch of things in now that try to accelerate that, from early settlement panels to mandatory financial or economic mediation to downright mediation to then getting to the judge and then trying the case.
I'm going to give you an example of, it was me and Danny D'Alessandro, now Judge D'Alessandro, back in the day, and our office had the wife whose father eventually became a judge, who recently passed away out of Union County, and Danny had the husband. They were both referrals from other people, and we sat in a conference room, just like the pre-mediation settlement kind of thing. Nothing was filed yet, and we asked them to pour out your hearts, tell us what's going on. And at the conclusion, Danny and I looked and said, I don't see any reason why you guys want to get divorced. We both got our asses reamed, literally, by the father saying, you don't know anything about this relationship. You don't know anything. And we're saying to myself, what did we miss? They just couldn't tell us what was really wrong.
Yeah.
And I guess, it's like a lot of things in life, and that divorce becomes a quote-unquote failure. A failure in life.
Well,
psychologically, from what I see in certain studies.
As far as psychological is concerned, you can have a host of psychological results from a host of psychological reasons, and who knows. The fact of the matter is, you can debate whether or not divorce is good, bad, or indifferent until the cows come home. But there are so many people who are in, number one, abusive relationships. For example, when I started, domestic violence wasn't even a thought in any.
Even though we saw it in the floor,
Absolutely.
We saw people beating the officers looking at it until it's finished and say, "Okay, ma'am, what do you want to do?"
Yep.
And they're just bleeding. They're time for court. I mean, just
and you have that kind of dysfunction. You have the dysfunction of being basically in a relationship that is unhappy and also infectious to everybody around it, children, relatives, and things like that. And it can be a second start. It can be, namely, a deacceleration of the tension, and many times that happens by sheer separation. All right? So it's not a failure, and as a matter of fact, I think most people who get divorced would say that they probably would have done it earlier, and they're very happy and more in control of their life now that they're divorced, rather than being in a relationship with a great deal of stress and strain.
And I'm sure some of your clients said, "I finally met Mr. Right."
Well,
no, I mean, at least they feel that way. It may take a couple years. And in my work, it's
sometimes
the widow.
You'd be surprised it doesn't take a couple of years.
It's already. It was there before. It
may have already been in place.
Could have been in court watching the show. But no, many times I have an estate where a young husband dies, and you look at the lady and say to yourself, she's too young to be without somebody. She's been with somebody for maybe 15 years, and now he's gone. And you had a great relationship, but hopefully in a couple of years you'll have somebody to be together with. And I just have such joy in seeing a new relationship, and
absolutely.
saying it's wonderful for them.
And a lot of times when people get divorced, and they're middle age people getting divorced, they're in a far better financial, psychological frame of mind and bank account, so to speak, to be able to be independent. Not being economically dependent on somebody else, and at that moment in time, they are open to new relationships because they're independent from their own life experience, probably have some money, and probably have a good job, and probably the children are either high school or maybe even totally emancipated. So it's a time of freedom, and they do meet people. And when they meet those people, they're meeting those people as a mature man or woman, as opposed to maybe perhaps a 19-year-old.
So let's get back to where we started. When you first practiced, the new courthouse was open. The old courthouse was closed by that time.
Yes.
And so most of the action was where, on the second floor, as far as family court goes.
That's
and
correct. It's always been on the second.
They had
floor.
landlord-tenant for a period of time.
Okay.
I remember that, but because I sometimes prefer that. I mean, it's not great where it's still
But then again, the landlord tenant moved up to the seventh floor.
Yeah, seventh floor, and then now it's over the first floor. But if you look at the transition of what's happened, even in your own field, in your opinion, have judges gotten more sensitive? Have they gotten more training in sensitivity? Have they got more training in terms of procedure and maybe the law? I mean, I've seen a progression of good. We always have new judges where we just hope that they shine a little bit more, or learn a little bit more, which is, or temperamentally do that. But I mean, you've been around enough to see a transition, and it'd be good for the viewers to hear your commentary about what you've seen as a practitioner in Hudson County.
Well, one of the main things you see is the diversity. When I started, not only were the judges, but the whole law practice was male dominated. You had a handful of women practicing law. Now,
Jessie Murphy, you remember her?
well, yes,
Yeah.
and there were about 4 or 5. Anna Marie
Insurance.
Paterno.
Yeah, but there are a lot of insurance or like Paterno was a solo, wasn't she?
Yes.
Yes.
And just an aside, those women had certain personality traits that were,
They were tough.
yes, they were more masculine because they felt that they had to be a part of that genre in order to be thought of as being an equal. Since then, the women in the bar have exploded. There are more women practicing law now than men. The law schools are 55% women. So that not only makes it diversified, but also brings a different philosophy, a different attitude, a different feeling in resolving, especially if you're in matrimonial, resolving sensitive personal issues. So the jurisprudence of itself changed with the injection of a feminist point of view. The other thing is with respect to procedures. Procedures have gotten very, very complicated. A lot of paperwork, a lot of we want this, that, or the other thing, whereas before it was all over the lot.
Do you find it somewhat burdensome? But I also know that the courts are driving more towards computerization, online stuff, filings. I know just a few years ago, my jeweler down the shore, he shows me a divorce complaint from Michigan. His wife is divorcing him from Michigan. It was online. No, it was actually served as paper, but all the responses had to be online. It was basically an uncontested divorce. So I decided to go on. I said, oh, this is really cool. And this is years ago, and we're not even close to being that. We were getting closer. But I said, this is pretty amazing for a state as big as Michigan doing this.
There's no question about it that the law practice is going to wind up to be paperless. The communications are different now than they ever were.
Do you think you're spending more time on emails than you are actually with client contact?
Oh, I think so. And I think, quite frankly, the emails, I'm not a real big fan of emails. I'd rather really talk to somebody and deal with them.
Because your practice of nature, you need to see eyeball to eyeball. I do a lot of wills, POAs, estate work, paper. So we do the first interview, send everything by email, let them approve it, then you can walk in and it's 1, 2, 3, wham, bam, thank you, man. Estates, it's all banking, this, that, and the other thing. Nothing contentious. So emails are so much more efficient. But there are times when you have to do the eyeball to eyeball because you want to know if this guy's. And I just had to fire a client recently because I couldn't trust her. I just couldn't. Just eyeball. Nothing made sense what she told me.
But also with respect to emails, they many times become evasive, and which if you had personal communication, even by phone, you would be able to clear up a lot of things and save a lot of time, energy, and effort.
No question. I don't think you could be autonomous. You have to be. Lawyers are meant to be personal. Lawyers are meant to be patient with their clients.
No question about it, because you're giving advice, and people are sharing with you some of the most intimate things dealing with their life, not only personally, but financially as well. The thing I was going to say was when you start talking about procedures and the judges and all of that, and your example with Michigan, the fact is that now on the internet you can get almost anything. And the reality is when people do get anything off the internet, it somewhat can be confusing to them and also be more harmful than helpful.
And confusing, that's right, because I read this on the internet, you're full of shit, or something along those lines. They basically say that, well, why would they post it if it wasn't true? And they said, well, wait a minute. And I remember a long time ago, you probably remember, there was a guy who gave financial advice on one of the radio stations. And then he got so hammered because New York law was so different than New Jersey that he would also have to couch it by saying, "Oh, but you better talk to a financial, better talk to your lawyer." And this is only good in New York State. You know, you had to really qualify it because there are certain things that it would drive me nuts. I said, I think his name was Meltzer. I said, "You got to shut him up because Meltzer's not going to get."
I kind of remember a guy by the name of Meltzer.
Yeah, he would give you advice and says, "This is not New Jersey," and we do guardianships. New York is so far advanced in terms of qualifying what a person can and cannot do in guardianships. We're just getting there, you know, and it's even remarkable with the Carolyn Quinlan case on the right to die. We were the first state with the New Jersey Supreme Court. Do you know, Greg, we were the last state to do it legislatively? Even Washington, D.C., we were the 51st government to actually adopt a law when it came to that. And so, believe it or not, our state bar was really ahead of the game, and we came out with guidelines, and to this day I still use theirs because it's better than whatever they can come up with. So
the thing I was going to say was, with the internet and all that kind of stuff, and even where the judiciary has spread out, more and more people have access to the courts,
phones and everything else,
and to the forms and things like that, because now, because we have more judges, people are able to get into court, especially in an urban community like Hudson County. You can get into court pro se because everything is available to you, and that's the philosophy, to open up the court system and the legal system to everybody.
And quite frankly, I think, and we're ready to wrap up. I think our judges, for the most part, are sensitive to the litigants, and they're not necessarily pro defendant or pro plaintiff. They really take a look and try to find out which is which, and they're sensitive to the consequences of whatever's going to happen to the person.
Oh, I agree with you on
that. They really, whether it's in divorce or landlord-tenant or in the guardianship case, I mean, we've had some really fine judges, and I have to be proud of our bench, and a lot of it has to do with the AOC and the Supreme Court in picking the right people when they moved. I remember Frank DeStefano. You remember Frank? Yeah, meeting him in Union County. So one of ours there. So anyway, Greg, thank you very much.
It was very enjoyable. Thank you, Lenny.